Today we're going to paint a dramatic sky, and what I like about doing skies is that there's really no wrong way to do it, and as you can see by my reference photo, you don't even really need a good reference photo. This reference photo is going to be my tool. I don't need to copy it slavishly. I'm just going to focus on the light and dark values, a little bit on the shapes and colors, but mostly just fixating on those values and trying to get an accurate depiction so I have that nice dramatic sky. And again, there's almost no wrong way to paint a sky, so it's really a good opportunity to have fun with watercolor and explore its qualities. So we're going to just get started and hopefully you learn something. And most of all, I hope you just take away that we can have a lot of fun with watercolor, and especially working wet and wet and creating something with a lot of dramatic light and dark values. So I'm going to start by mixing up some blue, and I'm going to work on the top right corner, which is kind of the blue that you would see on a summer day when the sky is free of clouds. And then we have these dark thunderheads moving in the lower part of the sky. I'm going to use ultramarine blue and cobalt blue and a little bit of Daniel Smith Verditer blue, and just mix that up in a puddle on my palette. And I have another palette off camera that you don't see. And my brush is large. I want to cover a lot of area quickly, and it's nice and juicy and full of water. And as you can see, my paper is quite shiny as soon as I start adding that water. I'm using enough pigment so that, or enough water so that the pigment flows downward and doesn't just stay where it's put without moving. The more water you add, the more it's going to move, and you want kind of a nice balance. You want it to be shiny wet and not drippy wet. And you can see already that pigment's just moving downward. I'm tilting my board a little bit so it can flow. And I'm going to wet actually my entire sky at this point. I always try to wet more than you think you're going to need. When you want that smooth transition of color fading away to nothing, you usually need to pull your water out further than you think so you don't get a line where the color meets the dry paper. So I'm just going to pull it straight out until I've filled my entire sky, and then we're actually going to paint the rest of the sky wet and wet. I want you to note too that I'm using sweeping brush strokes, going straight across, just keeping everything really, trying to keep it really smooth and get that flow going. You want your paintings to have a smooth and effortless feel. Your brush strokes need to kind of echo that. And now for the fun part, a little bit of sunrise or sunset color, and I'm using opera pink, just straight up. And when I'm working wet and wet like this, I don't do a lot of mixing of color in the palette because there's so much water on the paper. The colors are going to mix on their own, and I find that so much more dynamic than if I were to mix two colors together and just throw them on the page. Just gently touching in those colors. This is Naples yellow. And Naples yellow doesn't really move much on the page. Some colors will flow more than others. And so it mostly just stays where I put it. And knowing those qualities of your paint pigments will help you make decisions for how you're going to paint with them. I'm just switching to a smaller brush now. That big brush just holds so much water that I find I spend a lot of time blotting extra water out. So this is a number 18 round. And I'm going to do the rest of my cloud shapes with that. A little bit of straight ultramarine blue. That's going to flow down into the pink and make a bit of a violet where they meet and mingle. Trying not to touch it against the yellow too much. And when I do touch it, you can see I just went in there. I'm just dotting it in. I'm not rubbing and scrubbing. I don't want to create green. And so I prefer those colors to coexist kind of side by side rather than trying to mix them together. Of course. Then I had some kind of grayish, kind of a thundercloud shade of violet already in my palette, so I'm going to use that too. And now I'm going to work on those dark values which all fall in that along the tops of the clouds, and where the sun is positioned is going to affect what value your clouds are. In this case, the sun is low on the horizon, so the darkest clouds, the shadows are going to be along the tops of the clouds, and the lightest areas are going to be along the bottoms of the clouds. And of course, if the sun is high overhead, it's the opposite. You've got your lightest values, the sun reflecting off the tops of the clouds, and the darker shadows beneath them. So it really does depend on the position of the sun. And you also have to think about whether the sun is behind or in the midst of the clouds or in front of them for how it's going to reflect as well. So painting clouds is a really good way to study the different kinds of light you get at different times of day. And that's mostly straight Winsor violet or dioxazine violet. And I have added a little bit of Payne's gray to it as well, a little bit of ultramarine. And now I'm going to go in with a little bit of straight Payne's gray, which is my darkest color in my palette. And it's all just going to mix together in that nice wet surface that I have, nice shiny wet area, and create nice soft puffy clouds, and yet not moving so much that it all flows straight down. And you can see there's a bead of water happening at the bottom where my horizon line is. That's going to be hidden by trees, so we're not going to worry too much about that. I will blot it if it starts to look like it's going to drip. Do remember that the stronger your contrasts between light and dark, the more dramatic the sky and lighting is going to be. And I find that paintings that have strong value contrasts are very pleasing to the eye. And if you're visiting an art gallery or looking at art online, I encourage you, look at the paintings that catch your attention and look and see what the contrast between the values is. Squint at them so you can see where the lightest areas and the darkest areas are, and observe how different artists use value to create drama in a painting, to pull your eye in, to explore the painting, even to move your eye across the page. It's patterns of light and dark, more than the colors you use, that matter. I'm mixing up a little bit of a gray blue, and I usually do that by mixing cobalt or ultramarine blue with burnt umber. And that burnt umber has a little bit of orange in it so that it grays down the blue and creates a very pleasing gray. And I think it's still my favorite gray. And so I'm just going to keep trying to build those darks up. Don't be afraid to even add almost too much dark, because when we're working this wet, it's not hard to lift color up, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm not getting any sharp, hard edges at this point because I am working wet and wet. Everything's soft and blended because of the water on the page. We'll work on our edges on the final stages of the painting, and I want to punch up those values. As I'm working so wet, the colors do tend to spread a bit more, and they will often spread so you don't have those vibrant colors. You might want to go in with a little bit more color, and there's nothing wrong with adding more color. As long as your paper is shiny wet, you can keep adding and lifting. Do try to use a light touch. When paper is this wet, it is more delicate, so if you're scrubbing with your brush, you're disturbing the tooth of the paper. It might pill, or it just might get kind of a scrubbed look. And I can almost always tell a painting that's been overworked by the way the paper surface just isn't as smooth anymore. It kind of looks like it's been messed with. A little bit of Perylene Orange and Nicolezo Gold. Nicolezo Gold is a lot of fun, and I like to use it in wet and wet because it tends to really flow. It has a lot of movement in water. And just gently with those blues, I don't want to create mud by mixing my blue and my orange or my blue and my yellow. So just dotting it in rather than rubbing it. And I think it's about time to blot that puddle here in a sec. And that's cobalt turquoise right there. Dotting a little bit of that in. Just wanting to have some really interesting variety in my colors. Don't be afraid to put in more than you see in your photo. Photos are limited, and our artist's imagination is completely unlimited. You can do whatever you want and explore and dream and play. It's just paper. Yeah, just lifting off those puddles, and here I can also lighten up some of my values too. sometimes people confuse bright colors with lighter values, and actually sometimes a bright color like a red can be very dark in value. Black and white film stars, red lipstick look black on the screen, so using red doesn't mean you're adding bright light values to your painting. You're adding a bright color, but it's actually very dark in value and intensity. So you want to have those light values, and a lot of times that's just by making sure some of that white of the paper is showing through. I'm really liking how this first layer of clouds is shaping up. You can see a few areas where there's an edge because the water has pushed the pigment around, and here I'm just creating even a little more texture, a little more depth in my clouds by blotting and lifting some of that color. Make sure your paper towel doesn't have any rich pigment on it that's going to transfer onto your paper. You would hate to have a smear of red pigment and that sticks to your page in a spot where you don't want. So if you're lifting color, use a clean paper towel or one that shouldn't have any color that'll transfer. And I kind of have to keep turning mine to find a clean spot. And because our sky is the focal point, we really want to create those interesting edges, those interesting visual pathways through our page. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the landscape itself. I'm just going to paint the green grass of the field. And I'm using mostly green gold here for that. And just very loosely and lightly skipping my brush across the page. And allowing a little bit of white paper to show through. You can see the green is darker towards the top than at the bottom, just for a little more interest. And that little white showing through there adds a little sparkle. I'm also not touching my horizon with my paint or my sky with my paint because my sky is still wet. If my green gold touches the sky, it's going to bleed green gold up into the sky. So I'm leaving a little bit of a white edge there. And now I'm painting the shadows from my trees. Because the sun is low in the sky, there's a strong shadow at the tree line. And I'm using ultramarine blue for that. And you can see it's bleeding into the green gold and creating a really nice, rich, deep shadow, which I think is going to be very pleasing. And because that deep shadow is at the horizon, it's going to pull that eye right to the horizon line, and really not just, I wouldn't want my darkest area to be at the bottom of the page, because then your eye would be grounded at the bottom of the page. I want to pull the viewer into the painting. And I've also got a little white strip right there, because like I said, I don't want my paint bleeding up at this point. And so I've left a little white area between my sky and my land. And I think it's kind of pleasing. It was kind of just an artistic decision I just made, and because I like it, I'm going to leave it. I do like leaving little white areas of paper showing through. Okay, so I'm returning to this painting now after it's had a chance to thoroughly dry. And it's evening, so it's a little bit, the light's just not as good. And as you can see, my painting has dried considerably lighter than the original colors I laid down, and that's watercolor for you. And the good news about that is you can always go a little darker. It's a lot harder to go lighter once you've gone too dark. So we're just going to go and start enhancing and building up some of those beautiful cloud shapes that have happened, some of those blooms that created those cloudy edges that you can see in the darker areas of the sky. And by using watercolor to enhance those, it's just going to add more depth and some really beautiful layers. And I'm just painting right on the dry paper. You remember before I was painting on wet paper, and this time I have a little more control, and I can also create some crisp edges as I add color and water to my layers. And I like to start with a dark wash. Here it's Winsor violet or dioxazine violet and a little bit of Payne's gray, and I'm just creating some cloudy shapes, putting those darker clouds in behind the lighter, brighter ones, and pulling out with clear water to soften those edges while keeping some crisper edges closer to the lighter clouds. And I call this a lost and found edge technique, where you have a variation of line. It's not all one long solid crisp line, but it's broken up and some areas are flowing into others, while you also have some crisper areas that really command the eye and create more texture. And I'm usually putting on a little bit more darker color than what I want to have in that area, and then moving that color with my brush, pulling it across the page, adding a little clear water, and then that color gets diffused and lightened by the addition of more water. Again, I want to refer to my reference photo so that I can kind of keep an eye on the pattern of darks and lights. I'm not referring to it as much for color as I am for value placement. I think what's really fun and gratifying about this is that I could build up my clouds with layers upon layers and have enormous amount of depths in my painting, or I could do as few as 2 or 3 layers, just depending on, you know, the painting style, what I want to achieve in my painting, and you know, how much I feel like layering, I guess, at the time. The one thing you want to be careful of is not to cover over your lightest areas. You don't want to just go darker everywhere and then have a kind of even tone of, or even value of darks. We want to have those light areas pop out. So we're going to try to accentuate them. And sometimes that's a matter of putting dark values beside light values. The contrast really brings attention to that area of the painting. Right in the center here was where I wanted that rain cloud, the rain coming down, and so I'm just using some dark color and then clear water to pull that color down to the horizon. And that's a mixture of violet again and Payne's gray. And of course, as I'm working, my paper is getting wet again, so there is an element of working wet and wet here, but I did start with overall dry area of paper. But I can keep building up color as I paint, and yeah, it's going to get more wet and wet the longer I paint on this wet surface. And I guess the other thing I'm doing is darkening up the areas that dried a little lighter than I had planned for them to be. And brightening up some of those brighter areas, the pinks that I wanted to have in my sunset reflecting clouds. And the clouds really do reflect what's going on with the sun. So in this case, if it's a sunset, you're going to see that reflected in the colors of the clouds. Just like when the sun is really bright, your clouds are really white. They're reflecting that sun, or at least the ones that are in direct sunlight. And the nice thing is, because my first layer of paint was quite fluid, it wasn't a pasty, sticky application of pigment, it basically stays put as I'm layering it on these additional layers of wet and wet. It's not shifting and moving around as I add a new layer of water. And so I can kind of rely on it to stay put and build up over top of it without losing what's underneath. And I love that transparency that lets you work with what's showing through underneath while creating a brand new layer. And you can see right now creating a lost and found edge, adding clear water to soften those cloud lines again, rather than having just a sharp, crisp edge. And there is a place for that in cloud painting. You can see towards the center of the page I have that happening, but I do want a variation of edges between that crispness and the softness. And often that's a broken line. It's not just a solid crisp line. It's a crisp line that's broken up with softer areas bleeding through. I would really say my main role as I'm going into this second stage of layering paint is to deepen the values that are there, the dark values, and to start creating those edges of texture. So that's what I'm trying to keep foremost in my mind, is building up what's there, strengthening what's been put down in those foundational layers. I'm not trying to create something new at this point, although I can direct the painting to some extent without having to start all over with changing it. I can do a little bit of editing now, but I'm also just trying to work with what I've created in that first layer and create those shapes. And oh, it's fun to add those really rich dark colors as a contrast and a frame for the lighter values. And that was straight Payne's gray that I just added there. And you can see the power and the impact that those really dark values have on your painting. Little indigo and Payne's gray this time. And again, it's all serving to guide the eye. I really do have kind of a V shape happening in my painting, and I would say that's the compositional design. Using that V of clouds to direct the eye through the painting. The dark values are reinforcing that. And I'm really liking the drama that I see here. Lots of fun. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how my clouds turn out, and this is going to be a 2-layer cloud painting. Just because I like the shapes that I have here, I could keep building up more depths, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go straight into my trees and keep the clouds simple. And I'm using some Prussian green, I believe, here, mixed with a little bit of phthalo blue and a little bit of Payne's gray just to darken it up, and I'm painting that along the tops of the trees at this point. And what's happening here is by using a rich green, which is the Prussian green, and the Payne's gray, I'm using them separately. I didn't mix them together in the palette, and then they can mix and mingle a little bit on the paper, and that just creates a little more interest in my trees. And now I'm dropping in a little Nicolazo gold, and Nicolazo gold is awesome because as soon as you drop it in, it starts to push the other wet colors that are there in that wash. And so it almost creates the illusion of sunlight streaming through the trees, which I love. So I love adding Nicolazo gold to a wet wash and watching it push the other colors. It's kind of a bully that way and can create some great effects. And now I'm doing trees on the other side. I'm going to leave that little white gap that I like and just kind of have the trees fade away. Again, working with that Prussian green, same mixture, and Payne's gray. And it's just a shiny wet, just similar to how I painted my clouds. And then grabbing a little bit of that Nicolazo gold again and dotting it in. And you can see how it reacts on the paper. It's just so much fun. And as soon as I touch my gold brush to the paint, I pick up a little bit of green, and if I wanted to, I could even add that to my grass and create some grassy areas. I'm going to ground my trees with some dark Payne's gray. Of course, the trees would have a deep shadow where they meet the ground, and so the Payne's gray is going to serve to anchor them to the landscape and give that shadow that you would have at this time of day. And so that's just, again, bringing the eye right to the center of the page where the horizon and the sky meet. And I really like how I can draw people in there. Now I'm just tweaking a little bit, and I'm not sure if this is going to work. I want to soften that edge of tree here, but at the same time that green is going to want to run up the sky area. You can see it's being pulled up because of the water there. So I'm going to probably need to blot that a little bit so it doesn't the trees don't take over the sky. And you can see I'm just using a clean damp brush to do that, and if your brush is drier than your wash, it's going to act like a sponge and lift up that moisture. If your brush is wetter than your wash, then it's going to add more moisture to the page. So it just kind of depends on what you're doing. And now I got to go in and kind of fix that little bit of green that flowed up. Dropping a little bit of that violet in, the violet will dominate and push that green back to where it's supposed to go, at least if I've done this correctly. And it's never too late to ruin a painting. You never know, you might try something crazy and have it not turn out, and that just means you get to start a new painting if it's something that's completely unfixable. But it looks like I got it under control here. That green is not creeping up. And that just goes to show you that artists who've been painting for 20 years like I have make mistakes too. And in fact, pretty much every one of my paintings has mistakes in it. We're always challenging ourselves, always learning. There's always something I'm trying to do that might be too hard for me at my skill level. And I think if you're aware that you're going to be a lifelong student of watercolor, it gives you can make peace with the process of learning and have fun with wherever you're at, and kind of come to a place of acceptance and recognition that you're just going to keep growing, and that's the way it is. I'm just trying to blot a little drip that's happening here, and keep all those flowing colors under control. Now is a really good time to kind of evaluate what's missing, what needs to be strengthened and darkened, what needs to be tweaked. I'm adding a little more Opera Rose, my favorite color, and look how it's flowing down into my tree area. I kind of like it. I think I'm going to keep it and just pull it into my landscape a little bit. And that kind of connects my sky to my landscape a little bit, that little bit of Opera Rose that's creeping into my wet tree area. Kind of fun. And it's my painting, I get to do what I like, so if I think a dot of pink in my trees is appealing, I'm going to keep it there. Don't be afraid to spend more time thinking than you do painting. You don't have to just keep painting if you're not really quite sure what you should be doing. So here's my finished dramatic sky painting. I had a lot of fun with this one. I hope you'll be courageous and try some dramatic skies of your own, work on those strong value contrasts, and have fun with color. And I'd love to see what you're creating. You can visit my website or email me at angelafair.com, and I'd love to know how you've been inspired by this video.